The fog had rolled in off the Atlantic like a damp, grey wool blanket, muffling the cries of the gulls and turning the jagged peaks of Swyvern into ghostly teeth against a leaden sky. In the village of Lockdub, the air tasted of salt and peat smoke, a combination that usually promised a morning of productive lethargy for Police Constable Hamish Macbeth. Hamish stood by the window of his police station cum cottage, a tall, thin man with a shock of fiery red hair and eyes the colour of a Highland loch after a storm. He was currently engaged in a delicate tactical manoeuvre, ignoring the shrill, insistent ringing of the telephone. He knew that sound. It was the rhythmic, demanding ring of Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane, a man whose blood pressure was roughly equivalent to a steam boiler on the verge of explosion. "Let him ring, Lugs," Hamish murmured to the oversized ears of his mongrel dog, who was currently sprawled across a patch of rug, dreaming of rabbits. "If it's important, hell call the Sutherland Arms, and if I'm not there, then clearly I'm out on a grueling moorland patrol." In reality, Hamish's grueling patrol consisted of a slow walk toward the village stores. He needed coffee strong, black stuff that kept the damp from settling in his bone sand, perhaps a bit of gossip to see why the village was buzzing like a disturbed hive. The source of the agitation wasn't hard to find. Parked illegally across the narrow, potholed track that led to the old McCrae Croft was a vehicle that looked entirely too shiny for the Highlands. It was a rugged, top-of-the-line off-roader, the kind favoured by wealthy Londoners who wanted to look like they enjoyed the wilderness without actually touching any mud. A Sassenach, Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, remarked as Hamish drifted into the shop. She didn't look up from her sorting, but her nose seemed to twitch with professional curiosity. Mr. Geoffrey Waters bought the Macrae Place site unseen. Moved in yesterday with enough luggage to outfit an army and a temperament that would sour fresh milk. "Is that so?" Hamish asked mildly, reaching for a tin of coffee. "And what does Mr. Waters do when he isn't blocking the road?" "He consults, Hamish, whatever that means. He spent 20 minutes complaining that the broadband speed in Lockdub is prehistoric and told Archie McLean that his sheep were a noise nuisance. Archie told him where he could put his sheep, in no uncertain terms." Hamish sighed. A wealthy, arrogant Englishman with a penchant for litigation and a lack of local tact was exactly what Lockdub did not need. It was the sort of presence that invited accidents a sugar cube in a petrol tank, a fence mysteriously cut, or a very loud, very public row at the hotel. He paid for his coffee and retreated into the fog. He decided to take the long way back, passing by the McCrae Croft. He told himself it was to check the flow of the river for any signs of early salmon, but his instincts, the ones he kept carefully hidden behind a mask of village simplicity, were prickling. As he neared the croft, the silence of the fog was broken by a sharp, rhythmic sound. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It wasn't the sound of someone chopping wood. It was too precise, too clinical. Hamish crested the rise and saw Mr. Geoffrey Waters. The man was dressed in brand-new tweed that looked stiff enough to stand up on its own. He was standing in his garden, swinging a golf club with aggressive energy, launching white balls into the thick grey abyss of the loch. "You'll lose them all in this weather, sir," Hamish called out, leaning casually against a stone dike. Waters spun around, his face a mask of irritation. He was a man in his 50s with silvering hair and a jawline that suggested he spent a lot of time telling people they were fired. "And you are?" "Constable Macbeth, sir, local police." Waters looked Hamish up and down, taking in the slightly frayed uniform and the easy, slouching posture. A look of profound unimpressive flickered across his eyes. The village helped. "Tell me, Constable, is there someone I speak to about the smell? It's quite pungent, like rotting vegetation and—" "Wet dog. That would be the Highlands, sir," Hamish said with a thin, polite smile. "It has a way of getting under the skin. Just thought I'd mention your car is blocking the passing place. The milk lorry comes through at 6 tomorrow, and he's not a man for stopping. He'll move it when I am ready," Waters snapped, turning back to his golf. "I pay enough in taxes to expect a bit of service, not a lecture on traffic management from a man who looks like he's just woken up." Hamish nodded, his expression remaining perfectly blank. "Aye, sir. Just a friendly word." He turned and walked away, Lugs trotting at his heels. He didn't like Waters, but more importantly, he knew Lockdub. The village was like a pond. You couldn't drop a jagged, heavy stone like Geoffrey Waters into it without the ripples hitting everyone. And usually, when the ripples stopped, someone ended up underwater. The air felt colder now, and the mist seemed to cling to Hamish woolens like spiderwebs. He had a feeling his quiet day was already over. The heavy, damp silence that followed Hamish back to the village was eventually broken by a sound far more alarming than DCI Blair's telephone calls. It was the frantic, high-pitched keening of a car horn, blaring in short, panicked bursts from the direction of the Macrae Croft. Hamish, who had been contemplating the exact temperature of his porridge, felt a familiar sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. He sighed, adjusted his cap, and whistled for Lugs. The dog, sensing the change in his master's posture, abandoned his investigation of a particularly interesting clump of heather and trotted at Hamish's heels, his large ears twitching with localized anxiety. As they crested the rise again, the fog had thinned just enough to reveal the shiny off-roader. It was no longer parked arrogantly across the track. It had been reversed at an erratic angle into a stone wall, its back bumper crumpled like a discarded tin of sardines. Standing by the open driver's door was a woman Hamish hadn't seen before, presumably Mrs. Waters. She was dressed in an expensive-looking cream silk blouse that was currently splattered with mud, and her face was the colour of unbaked dough. "Officer, thank God!" she shrieked, clutching her throat as Hamish approached at his usual deceptive, slow-motion gait. "In the garden, the Gulf, Geoffrey, he's—" "Deep breaths now, Mrs. Waters," Hamish said, his voice a low, soothing burr that acted like a sedative. "Just tell me what's happened. Is your husband unwell?" "He's not unwell. He's ridiculous," she sobbed, though her eyes were wide with a genuine shivering terror. "I went out to tell him the tea was poured, and I found him. He's stuck. Oh, it's horrible." Hamish moved past her, his boots squelching in the peat. He rounded the corner of the cottage to the patch of grass where Waters had been practicing his swing not 20 minutes earlier. The scene that met him was, as the prompt of his intuition had suggested, bizarre and slightly humiliating. Geoffrey Waters was indeed in the garden, but he was no longer swinging a club. He was face down in a particularly boggy patch of ground near the edge of the loch. What made the sight truly macabre was that he appeared to have been driven into the soft earth like one of his own golf tees. His head and shoulders were submerged in the black, peaty muck, and his stiff, expensive tweed jacket was hitched up around his waist. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and a silver-headed driver was snapped cleanly in half, the jagged shaft protruding from the back of his neck like a misplaced lightning rod. Lugs let out a low, mournful howl and sat down firmly several yards away, refusing to come any closer. Hamish knelt by the body, careful not to disturb the muddy footprints that churned the area. He reached out a long, calloused hand and felt for a pulse on the one visible wrist, though he already knew what he wouldn't find. The skin was cooling rapidly in the Highland chill. "Well now," Hamish murmured to himself, his blue eyes darting over the scene. "That's a very messy way to go, Mr. Waters." It wasn't just the snapped club that bothered him. It was the position. Waters had been a fit man, arrogant and strong. To be shoved head-first into a peat bog required either immense strength or a very sudden, very surprising blow to the back of the head. Hamish looked at the snapped golf club. The break was clean, suggesting it hadn't snapped during a struggle, but perhaps had been used as a lever, a trophy. He stood up, his knees cracking in the silence. The irritation he had felt early of lazy policemen's resentment at having his morning rewind-was being replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He looked back at the house. Mrs. Waters was leaning against her damaged car, wailing into a designer handkerchief. Beyond her, the road to Lochstub remained empty, but Hamish knew that wouldn't last. The moment he picked up his radio, the peace of the glen would be shattered by Strathbane police sirens. He took a small notebook from his pocket and began to sketch the scene with quick, precise strokes. He noted the position of the broken club, the way the mud had splashed upward onto the nearby stone dike, and the fact that there were no golf balls visible on the grass. Waters had been hitting them into the loch, but there should have been a bucket or a bag nearby. There was nothing but dead man and haze. "A bad business, Lugs," Hamish said softly. "A very bad business. And Blair will be here within the hour, shouting and trampling over every bit of evidence we've got. I'd better get a look at the house before the circus arrives." He started toward the grieving widow, but his eyes stayed on the perimeter of the property. Someone had been watching Waters. Someone who knew exactly how much the man was loathed after only 24 hours in the village. As he walked, Hamish wasn't thinking about forensics or DNA. He was wondering who in Lochstub owned a pair of boots with a hobnailed pattern exactly like the one head just spotted, half hidden by a clump of gorse 10 feet from the body. The lazy policeman was gone. The hunter had woken up, and he was very, very hungry for the truth. The distant wail of a siren began to tear through the fog, growing from a faint, ghostly moan into a shrill, aggressive scream that echoed off the surrounding hills. Hamish winced, the sound vibrating in his teeth. It was the herald of DCI Blair's arrival, a man who treated every crime scene like a personal insult and every subordinate like a malfunctioning appliance. Lugs retreated further into the gorse, his tail tucked low, sharing his master's desire to be anywhere but at the center of the impending storm. A fleet of white and blue police vehicles skidded to a halt on the narrow track, spraying gravel and mud over the already traumatized Mrs. Waters. From the lead car, a man exploded outward like a cork from a pressurized bottle. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was a thick-set man with a face the color of a gnar, overripe plum, and a neck that seemed to have been entirely subsumed by his collar. Behind him trailed the usual retinue, Jimmy Anderson, looking hungover and bored, and a few younger constables who moved with the frantic energy of people trying to avoid being shouted at. "Macbeth!" Blair roared before his feet had even fully planted on the sodden earth. "I might have known yow'd be standing around with your hands in your pockets while a taxpayer gets murdered in your backyard. Look at you! You look like you've just come from a 3-day nap in a haystack." Hamish touched the peak of his cap in a slow, languid gesture that he knew infuriated the DCI. "Good morning to you too, sir. I've secured the perimeter as best I can, though the mist is a bit of a devil for visibility." "Perimeter? You wouldn't know a perimeter if it bit you on your lazy backside," Blair snapped, shoving past Hamish and nearly knocking him into a puddle. He stomped toward the body, his heavy boots obliterating several of the delicate impressions Hamish had been studying moments before. "My God, what a mess. Look at this, Anderson. The man's been planted like a turnip. It's obviously a local job. Some thick-headed crofter with a grudge and a lack of imagination." "The deceased is Mr. Geoffrey Waters, sir," Hamish offered mildly, following at a respectful, if slightly detached, distance. "He only arrived yesterday. Had a bit of a disagreement with Archie McLean about some sheep, and I believe had already made quite an impression on the postmistress." Blair turned, his eyes bulging. "Archie McLean? The one who's always complaining about his subsidy? Perfect. He's our man. It's a classic case of peasant rage. He probably followed him out here, took exception to the golf, and gave him a shove. Case closed by lunchtime. Anderson, go find McLean and bring him in. Tell him he can explain his peasant rage down at the station." "Sir!" Hamish intervened softly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the wind. "The club is snapped. It's a clean break. And there's the matter of the hobnail prints over by the gorse. They don't quite match the stride of a man Archie's age. He's been walking with a limp since the winter, you see." Blair turned a shade of purple that was almost impressive. "I don't care about hobnails, Macbeth, and I certainly don't care about your local knowledge regarding the village elder's orthopedic issues. You're a village bobby, a relic, a glorified traffic warden. You see a mystery because you want to justify your existence. I see a dead Englishman and a village full of surly Scots who hate outsiders. It's math, Macbeth. Simple math." He turned his back on Hamish, effectively dismissing him, and began shouting, orders to the forensic team who were now gingerly picking their way through the mud. Blair's approach was a sledgehammer where a scalpel was required. He was already directing his men to turn the house upside down and scare the widow into a confession if the McLean lead didn't pan out immediately. Hamish stood on the periphery, his eyes fixed on the broken golf club. He noticed something Blair had missed in his rush to condemn the local crofters. A small, bright yellow thread caught in the jagged wood of the snapped shaft. It was synthetic, the kind of fibre used in high-visibility workwear, or perhaps a modern waterproof jacket. It certainly didn't belong to Archie McLean's moth-eaten woolens. "You're dismissed, Macbeth," Blair yelled over his shoulder, not even looking back. "Go back to your station and try not to fall asleep on the job. Well handle the real police work. And take that flea-bag dog with you before it contaminates the scene any further." Hamish didn't argue. He knew that to stay was to be a target for Blair's bile, and more importantly, being sidelined gave him exactly what he needed. The freedom to move unseen. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from the bushes with a look of profound relief. As he walked back toward the village, the sirens now silent but the air still thick with the tension of the investigation, Hamish felt the familiar weight of the task ahead. Blair would arrest Archie, the village would close ranks, and the real killer one with the hobnail boots and the yellow jacket would be laughing behind a closed door. He didn't head for the police station. Instead, he made a beeline for the back entrance of the Sutherland Arms Hotel. The real investigation wouldn't happen in the mud of the Macrae Croft. It would happen over a pot of tea and a plate of Mrs. Wellington's scones, where the silences were louder than Blair's shouting. The back door of the Sutherland Arms Hotel creaked open with a familiar groan, admitting Hamish and a damp, expectant Lugs into the fragrant warmth of the kitchen. Here, the air was a thick, comforting fog of roasting lamb and flour, a stark contrast to the cloying, salty mist of the loch side. Mrs. Wellington, the hotel's formidable cook and unofficial keeper of the village's moral compass, was currently beating a bowl of batter with such ferocity that it sounded like a drum roll. She didn't turn, but her shoulders stiffened. "I suppose Yow'll be wanting tea, Hamish Macbeth, and a bit of news to go with it, seeing as the village is crawling with those shouting men from Strathbane." "A pot of the strong stuff would be a blessing, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, sliding into a wooden chair by the range. He looked every bit the picture of a man who had given up on a difficult day, his long legs stretched out and his cap tilted back. Luggs rested his chin on Hamish's boot, eyeing a stray piece of suet on the floor. "DCI Blair is convinced he's found his man in Archie McLean. He's looking for peasant rage, you see." Mrs. Wellington snorted, a sound of pure Highland derision. She set a steaming mug and a plate of warm buttered scones in front of him. Archie McLean hasn't had enough rage in him to kill a midge since his hip went out. If that man in the croft is dead, it's not because of a sheep dispute. That Mr. Waters was a nasty piece of work, Hamish. He came in here last night, demanding a proper gin and tonic, and telling Mr. Johnson that the Dacre was quaint, but depressingly shabby. Hamish took a slow sip of the tea, letting the heat seep into his chest. He didn't ask questions, he simply waited. In Lochdub, information was like a shy animal. If you chased it, it ran away, but if you sat still long enough, it eventually came out to feed. He had a way of making people feel small, Hamish murmured.
"I noticed it myself."
"He did more than that," Mrs. Wellington said, lowering her voice as she leaned over the table. "He wasn't just here for the scenery. He was talking on that mobile phone of his shouting, really about closing the deal and levelling the eyesore. Turns out he didn't just buy the croft, Hamish. He'd been buying up the options on the old pier and the strip of land behind the curry shop. He wanted to build a luxury wellness retreat, a glass box for wealthy Londoners to sit in and stare at the locals like they were fish in a tank." Hamish paused with a scone halfway to his mouth. This was the dirty secret Blair would never find. To an outsider, a wellness retreat sounded like progress. To a Highlander, it was an invasion, a death knell for the quiet isolation that made Lochdub home. "The curry shop, you say? I suppose Mr. Patel wasn't too pleased about his view being replaced by a glass box." Pleased? He was incandescent, and he was not alone. That young fellow, the one doing the council repairs on the seawall, one with the bright yellow van. He was here too, looking like thunder. Apparently, Waters told him his work was substandard and threatened to have his contract pulled if he didn't move his equipment off the private road. Hamish's mind flashed back to the jagged splinter of wood on the golf club and the tiny, bright yellow synthetic thread head spotted. A yellow van, yellow workwear, and a man whose livelihood was being threatened by an arrogant newcomer. The pieces were beginning to drift together, but they didn't quite form a picture yet. The lad on the seawall, Hamish mused. That would be Peter, the one from over Killearn Way. "The same," Mrs. Wellington confirmed, returning to her batter. "A hard-working boy, but he has a temper like a dry tinderbox. He was wearing one of those neon jackets that hurts the eyes just to look at. He left here in a hurry last night, after Waters gave him a tongue-lashing in front of everyone." Hamish finished his tea and stood up, feeling the weight of the investigation shifting. He had enough now to know that Blair's peasant rage theory was half right, but directed at the wrong peasant. However, there was a missing link. To kill a man by driving him into the mud like a golf tee required a specific, twisted kind of dark humour, a very particular kind of expertise in moving heavy things. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, settling his cap. "I think I'll take Luggs for a wander down by the seawall. The salt air might clear my head. And keep it clear, Hamish," she called after him, "before that man Blair decides you're an accessory for being too slow to stop him." Hamish stepped out into the mist, his deceptive laziness masking a mounting urgency. He needed to find Peter, but he also knew that in such a village, social dynamics were never simple. There was a romantic thread he hadn't pulled yet, a conversation he needed to have with someone who understood the upper-class arrogance of a man like Waters better than anyone. It was time to find Priscilla. The mist was thicker down by the water, smelling of brine and rotting kelp, but Hamish didn't head straight for the seawall. Instead, he steered his path toward the driveway of Tommel Castle, the ancestral home of the Halberton Smythes. He knew that if he wanted to understand the friction Geoffrey Waters had caused, he needed to speak to someone who navigated the world of high finance and higher egos with ease. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was currently at the castle, and while her relationship with Hamish was a tangled knot of mutual respect and frustrated affection, she was the only person who could bridge the gap between the rough reality of Lochdub and the polished arrogance of a man like Waters. He found her in the stable yard, looking effortlessly elegant in a barber jacket and Wellington boots that actually looked like they had seen work. She was grooming a sleek bay gelding, the rhythmic brush strokes, a sharp contrast to the chaotic energy currently vibrating from the village. She looked up as Hamish approached, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "I heard the sirens, Hamish," she said, her voice like cool silk. "And I heard DCI Blair has already decided that Archie McLean is a cold-blooded assassin. I assume you're here because you disagree?" "Archie couldn't assassinate a bag of flour without needing a sit-down afterward," Hamish said, leaning against the stable door, while Luggs busied himself sniffing a discarded horseshoe. "But Waters was treading on a lot of toes, Priscilla. Mrs. Wellington says he was planning a wellness retreat." "That sounds like the kind of thing your father would have an opinion on." Priscilla sighed and set down the brush. "He does. Waters came here 2 days ago. He didn't want a neighbourly chat, he wanted to buy the fishing rights to the upper stretch of the river. He offered a ridiculous amount of money, then became quite nasty when father refused. He called us land-poor aristocrats clinging to a dead way of life. He mentioned that once his development was finished, he'd have enough influence with the council to make the fishing rights irrelevant anyway. He was a man who didn't like the word no," Hamish mused. "But there's something else. Mrs. Wellington mentioned a lad named Peter working on the seawall. Waters had threatened his contract." Priscilla's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Peter is a good boy, Hamish, but he's incredibly proud. He's been building this small business for 3 years. If Waters followed through on his threat to pull the council contract, Peter would lose everything: his van, his equipment, probably his house. But there's something you might not know. Waters wasn't just a businessman, he was a perfectionist of the most sadistic kind. He'd been filming the workmen. He told father he was keeping a digital dossier of every mistake the locals made to use as leverage." Hamish straightens, his blue eyes sharpening. "A digital dossier? Where would he keep that?" "On his person, I'd imagine. He had one of those high-end smartphones and a tablet he carried everywhere. He was quite obsessed with it. He even filmed me during our walk, pointing out inefficiencies in how the estate was managed." This was the missing piece of the social puzzle. Waters wasn't just an arrogant Sassenach. He was a voyeur who used technology to bully people who lived by older, simpler rules. To a man like Peter, who valued his reputation above all else, being filmed and mocked would be a humiliation worse than the financial loss. "Blair is too busy shouting at Archie to look for a phone," Hamish said, more to himself than to Priscilla. "And if that phone contains footage of someone losing their temper, it's a motive far stronger than a dispute over sheep." "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla said softly, stepping closer. "If Peter did this, or if someone else is being protected, the village will stay silent. They'll let Blair arrest Archie and then find a way to let him off later, rather than hand one of their own to a man like that. You're the only one who cares about the actual truth, rather than just the conviction." "I care about staying in Lochdub," Hamish corrected with a dry wink. "And if Blair gets a conviction, even a wrong one, hell be so pleased with himself he might just try to take me back to Strathbane as his lucky charm. I can't have that." He turned to leave, his mind already racing. He had a motive of humiliation and financial ruin, and he had a potential weapon in the form of a digital dossier that was currently missing from the crime scene. As he walked back toward the seawall, the fog began to lift, revealing the jagged coastline and the figure of a young man in a bright yellow jacket, standing motionless by a pile of granite blocks. The red herring of Archie McLean was fading, and the real, darker shape of the crime was beginning to take form. The granite blocks of the seawall stood like cold, grey sentinels against the churning waters of the Minch as Hamish approached. The young man in the neon yellow jacket, Peter, was ostensibly working, but his movements were stiff and mechanical. He was heaving a heavy pry bar with a desperation that suggested he was trying to bury his thoughts in physical labour. Hamish watched him for a moment, noting the way the boy's hands shook as he wiped sweat from his forehead. The yellow fabric of his jacket was bright, painfully sewn. Hamish's mind returned to the tiny synthetic thread head scene snagged on the broken golf driver. "It's a heavy business, moving stone," Hamish said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the crashing waves. Peter jumped, nearly dropping the pry bar. He turned, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting toward the village, where the blue lights of the police cars still flickered like malevolent fireflies. "Aye, it is that, Hamish," Peter replied, his voice thin. "I heard they've taken Archie. It's a disgrace. Everyone knows Archie doesn't have the knees for murder. Blair's just looking for an easy target so he can get back to his warm office in Strathbane." "Blair sees what he wants to see," Hamish agreed, moving closer and leaning his back against a pile of rubble. He looked out at the water, appearing entirely uninterested in Peter's reaction. He sees a grumpy Crofter and a dead Sassenach and thinks the story is finished. But I was thinking about what Priscilla Halberton-Smythe told me, about a phone, a digital dossier, she called it.
Waters was filming people, Peter.
Filming them when they were angry, or when they made a mistake. It's a cruel thing to hold a man's life in a little plastic box. Peter's grip on the iron bar tightened until his knuckles went white. He was a devil, Hamish. He didn't understand that a man's work is his word. He stood there with that camera, mocking the way we did things, telling me I was quaint and unqualified. He was going to send those videos to the council. He was going to break me just for the sport of it. And where is the box now, Peter? The one with the videos? Peter looked away, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. I wouldn't know. Maybe it went into the lock with his golf balls. Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound. That's what Blair will think, or hell think Archie threw it away. But I noticed something back at the Croft. There were hobnail prints in the mud, distinctive ones. And I remember seeing a pair of boots like that drying on your porch last week when I came by to talk about the station's gutter. The silence that followed was heavy with the salt spray and the weight of unspoken words. Peter slumped, the pry bar clattering to the stones. I didn't kill him, Hamish. I swear on my mother's soul. I went there to talk to him. I went to beg him, really, to delete the footage. He just laughed. He was standing there by the bog, hitting those balls, and he told me I was precisely the kind of Highland deadwood he intended to clear away. I lost my temper. I grabbed his club, that big silver driver, and I snapped it. I wanted to show him I wasn't some weakling he could bully. But I didn't hit him. He stepped back, startled, and his heel caught on a tussock of grass. He fell backward, head first into the soft peat. It happened so fast. He didn't even scream. Hamish didn't move. He watched a lone heron pick its way across the rocks. And the phone? It fell out of his pocket when he went down, Peter whispered. I saw it lying there in the mud. I thought, if I took it, the evidence against me would be gone. The evidence of our row. So I grabbed it, and I ran. I thought Head just crawl out, muddy and furious. I didn't know Head stick there. I didn't know the peat was that deep, or that Head hit his head on the way down. He hit a stone on the way in, Peter. The blow stunned him, and the mud did the rest, Hamish said softly. He felt a pang of sympathy for the lad, but he knew the truth was more complex than a simple accident. Peter's story proved Archie was innocent of the act, but it didn't quite explain the humiliating way Waters had been found, nor did it account for the hidden motive that Hamish could feel lurking just beneath the surface of the village gossip. I have the phone, Hamish, Peter said, reaching into his yellow jacket. I haven't broken it. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Keep it, Hamish said, much to Peter's surprise. For now. Blair is about to charge Archie. If I take that phone to him now, he'll just charge you instead and call it a day. But I think there's someone else who was watching that garden. Someone who didn't just watch a man fall, but who might have made sure he didn't get back up. Hamish stood, whistling for lugs. He had cleared the red herring of Archie's guilt, but the real mystery was just beginning. If Peter had run away while Waters was still alive, even if he was stuck some Ione, else had been there to witness the perfectionist's final, muddy moments. And that person had a reason for staying silent that went far beyond protecting a local lad. The damp air seemed to thicken as Hamish left Peter by the seawall, the boy's terrified face etched into his mind. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, and while the accident Peter described explained the strange position of the body, it didn't account for the cold, calculated silence of the aftermath. If Waters had simply tripped, a man of his fitness might have struggled, however feebly. But the angle of the neck and the way the body had been planted suggested a final, deliberate chevalier coup de grace delivered by someone who had watched the confrontation from the shadows and decided that a trapped man was a golden opportunity. Hamish walked toward the village centre, his mind skipping past the obvious suspects. He passed the curry shop where the scent of turmeric and cumin battled the salt air. Mr. Patel was outside, sweeping the step with a vigour that suggested a sudden release of nervous energy. He nodded to Hamish, but his eyes were guarded. Hamish didn't stop to chat. He knew the motive wasn't just about a wellness retreat or a blocked view. Those were the grievances of the living. The motive for murderial, cold-blooded murderers, almost always buried in the past or hidden in the ledgers. He steered his path toward the village registrar's office, a tiny, cramped room adjacent to the post office. Mrs. Kennedy was there, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she pored over a stack of yellowing property deeds. She looked up, her expression sour. If you're looking for Blair, he's over at the station making poor Archie's life a misery. He's shouting about forensic breakthroughs while the whole village knows he's just bullying a man who can't defend himself. I am not looking for the DCI, Hamish said, leaning over the counter and dropping his voice. "I am looking for the history of the Macrae Croft. Not just who bought it, but who didn't." Priscilla mentioned that Waters was buying up options on the pier and the land behind the shops. Who was he buying them from? Mrs. Kennedy's eyes sharpened. She liked Hamish, mostly because he never made her feel rushed, and he always remembered her favourite brand of digestive biscuits. The land was held in a blind trust, Hamish. Very modern, very secretive. But before Waters arrived, there was another interested party. A firm out of Edinburgh representing a private investor. They were offering pennies on the pound, trying to squeeze the locals out before the development was even announced. Waters outbid them by a mile. He didn't just buy the land, he stole the prize out from under someone's nose. And who was the local contact for that Edinburgh firm? Hamish asked, his heartbeat quickening. Mrs. Kennedy hesitated, then pulled a ledger from beneath the desk. It's all supposed to be confidential, mind. But the local surveyor who did the valuation, the one who told everyone the land was worthless, so the Edinburgh firm could swoop in, was Mr. Forbes, the minister's brother-in-law. Hamish knew Mr. Forbes. He was a quiet, unassuming man who lived in a cottage draped in honeysuckle. A man who seemed to have no interest in anything but his garden and his collection of antique maps. But Forbes had been advising the village on the inevitable decline of property values. If Waters had arrived and started paying top dollar, he hadn't just ruined a development deal. He had exposed Forbes as a fraud who was helping an outside firm swindle his own neighbours. And Waters had a phone, Hamish murmured, more to himself than Mrs. Kennedy. A phone filled with videos of people making mistakes. I wonder if he filmed a certain surveyor taking a kickback or misrepresenting a deed. He thanked Mrs. Kennedy and stepped back into the chilly afternoon. The fog was beginning to settle again, turning the world into a series of blurred grey shapes. He knew now that Peter had provided the opportunity, but someone else had provided the intent. Waters had been a man who collected leverage like other men collected stamps. He had likely confronted Forbes, mocking him with the evidence of his corruption, just as he had mocked Peter with the evidence of his substandard work. The villain wasn't the arrogant outsider or the hot-headed boy. It was the invisible man who had spent years cultivating a reputation for honesty while quietly selling the village piece by piece. Hamish felt a cold anger rising. Blair was currently preparing to ruin Archie McLean's life for a crime of peasant rage, while the real killer was likely sitting at home, sipping tea and waiting for the dust to settle. He whistled for lugs, his pace quickening for the first time that day. He needed to set a trap, and he needed to do it before Blair officially charged Archie. He needed the phone Peter was holding, but he also needed a way to make Forbes' car. Believe the digital dossier was about to be opened in front of the entire village. The village of Locked was a place where news travelled faster than the wind off the Atlantic, and Hamish knew exactly how to harness that gale. He didn't head for the police station where Blair's muffled roars could still be heard echoing through the stone walls. Instead, he made a slow, deliberate circuit of the village. He stopped first at the post office to buy a single stamp, mentioned to Mrs. Kennedy that something very interesting had been recovered from the mud by the seawall, and then drifted toward the curry shop. By the time he reached the Sutherland Arms a second time, the rumour mill was already grinding. The whisper was simple but lethal. Hamish Macbeth had found the black box of Geoffrey Waters, and it was currently sitting on his kitchen table, charging up. Hamish knew that a man like Mr. Forbes, who built his life on the sturdy foundation of a good reputation, would find the prospect of a digital dossier unbearable. If Waters had indeed captured proof of Forbes double-dealing with the Edinburgh firm, the surveyor wouldn't be able to resist the urge to see if that evidence had survived the peat bog. Hamish returned to his cottage, which doubled as the police station, and made a show of closing the curtains. He lit a single lamp, creating a silhouette that could be seen from the road image of a man hunched over a small, glowing screen. Inside, however, Hamish was doing nothing more than nursing a final pot of coffee and scratching lugs behind the ears. The glowing screen was actually a bicycle safety light head propped up against a loaf of bread. He had the real phone, the one Peter had surrendered, tucked safely in his pocket, but he didn't need to turn it on yet. He just needed to wait for the moth to fly toward the flame. He knew Blair would be occupied for at least another hour, filling out the mountain of paperwork required to officially ruin Archie McLean's life, which gave Hamish a narrow window of opportunity. The mist had turned into a fine, freezing drizzle by the time a soft footfall sounded on the gravel outside. It wasn't the heavy, flat-footed stomp of a policeman or the rhythmic click of a woman's heel. It was a hesitant, light-stepped step of a man who spent his life measuring boundaries and calculating distances. A shadow fell across the door, and then came a polite, almost timid knock. "Hamish? Are you in there, man?" The voice belonged to Mr. Forbes. It was strained, pitched a fraction too high to be natural. Hamish didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, knowing that for a guilty man, silence is a vacuum that pulls the truth out of the lungs. He waited until he heard the latch rattle, a sound of growing desperation before he finally stood up and opened the door. "Mr. Forbes!" "This is a surprise," Hamish said, blinking as if he'd just been roused from a deep sleep. He stood in the doorway, blocking the view of the interior. "I'd invite you in for a drama, but I'm right in the middle of a very delicate bit of business. DCI Blair wants me to catalogue some electronic evidence. Horrible things, these phones. They remember everything, don't they?" Forbes' face was a pale oval in the darkness. He was wearing his raincoat, the collar turned up, but his hands were ungloved and twitching at his sides. "I heard a rumour, Hamish, in the shop. They said You'd found Waters recordings. I thought, well, as a village friend I figured I should offer my services. I know a bit about these devices. If it's damaged by the water, I might be able to help you recover the files before Blair sees them. You know how I shall probably delete something important by accident." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Forbes," Hamish said, his voice dripping with a deceptive, honeyed warmth. "Truly, it's a tragedy, isn't it? A man dies in the mud, and all his secrets stay behind in a little glass case. I was just looking at a video titled Valuation Discrepancy. I haven't watched it yet. The battery is quite low, you see. I was waiting for it to reach 10% before I hit play." He saw the Adam's apple in Forbes' throat bob convulsively. The surveyor stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the glow coming from the kitchen table. 10%? That's plenty. Let me have a look, Hamish, for the sake of the village. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings to cloud the investigation." Hamish stepped back, allowing the man to enter the room. As Forbes hurried toward the glowing bicycle light, his face twisted in a mask of predatory anxiety, Hamish reached out and quietly turned the key in the lock. The trap had snapped shut, and the invisible man of Lockstub was finally standing in the light. Mr. Forbes reached the kitchen table and froze. The glowing evidence was revealed to be nothing more than a plastic bicycle lamp reflecting off a crust of bread. The silence that filled the small cottage was no longer the comfortable quiet of a Highland evening. It was the suffocating pressure of a storm about to break. Forbes turned slowly, his face drained of colour, his eyes darting toward the locked door behind Hamish. The polite, unassuming surveyor seemed to shrink within his raincoat, his hands trembling violently as he realised the depth of the hole he had dug for himself. "It's a bit of a disappointment, isn't it?" Hamish said softly, his back against the door and his arms folded across his chest. Luggs let out a low, vibrating growl from the corner, his hackles raised. "To come all this way for a bicycle light. But then, you weren't really interested in the technology, were you, Mr. Forbes? You were interested in the valuation discrepancy. A clever name I made up, but it hit the mark. You've been working with those Edinburgh developers to steal this village from under the feet of people you've known your whole life. You don't understand, Macbeth," Forbes hissed, his voice losing its timid edge and sharpening into something cold and desperate. "Lockstub is dying. It needs investment. If I took a commission to facilitate a smoother transition, it was for the greater good. Waters was a fool. He was a loud, arrogant peacock who was going to ruin everything with his wellness retreats and his lawsuits. He learned about my arrangement with the Edinburgh firm. He had it emails, bank statement shed hacked into my personal files. And so you followed him," Hamish prompted, his blue eyes hard. "You watched from the gorse as young Peter snapped that club and ran away. You saw Waters stuck in the mud, helpless and humiliated. It was a gift from Providence, wasn't it? A chance to delete your problems and the man holding them in one go." Forbes took a step toward Hamish, his face twisting. He was laughing, even face down in the peat. He was muffled, but he was laughing at me. He told me I was a petty little clerk and that he was going to enjoy watching me go to prison. I didn't plan it. I just wanted him to stop talking. I put my foot on his back, and I pushed. I pushed until the bubbles stopped. I am a respected man, Macbeth. I won't let a lazy, red-haired nothing like you take that away from me. With a sudden, frantic cry, Forbes lunged. For a man of his age and sedentary profession, he moved with a surprising, wiry strength fueled by pure panic. He didn't go for Hamish's throat, he went for the heavy iron poker resting by the peat stove. He swung it in a blind, whistling arc that would have cracked Hamish's skull had the constable not possessed the reflexes of a man who spent his nights poaching salmon from guarded rivers. Hamish ducked, the iron whistling over his head and shattering a ceramic teapot on the dresser. Now, Mr. Forbes," Hamish grunted, stepping inside the man's guard. "There's no need for that. You'll only make the charges heavier." But Forbes was beyond reason. He swung again, stumbling over a kitchen chair. Hamish moved with a deceptive fluidity, his large hands reaching out to catch the man's wrists. They grappled for a moment, the surveyor spitting curses that would have shocked his brother-in-law, the minister. Hamish was taller and possessed the lean, hard muscle of a Highlander, but Forbes was fighting for his life. They crashed against the kitchen table, sending the bicycle light spinning across the floor. In the chaotic shadows, Luggs decided he had seen enough. The dog didn't bite, but he threw his considerable weight against Forbes' knees. The surveyor buckled, and Hamish used the momentum to pivot, pinning Forbes against the wall with a firm but controlled grip. The poker clattered to the floor. Forbes gasped for air, his strength suddenly deserting him as the reality of his situation crashed down. He slumped in Hamish's arms, a broken man whose respectability had finally dissolved into the mud of his own making. "It's over, man," Hamish said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "The phone Peter took has everything. Even if I hadn't tricked you tonight, the truth was always going to come out of that little box. You should have known in Lochdub. Even the mud has ears." Hamish reached for his handcuffs, the cold metal clicking with a finality that seemed to echo through the quiet village. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the tracks of the day, but inside the small station, the air was clear for the first time since the Sassenach had arrived. All that remained was the delicate task of ensuring the credit went exactly where it needed to go, far away from Hamish Macbeth. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the room until the heavy thud of a fist on the front door shattered the silence. Hamish looked down at the shivering, defeated form of Mr. Forbes, then at the shattered remains of his favourite teapot. He knew the next few minutes would be the most dangerous part of the entire investigation. If he presented Forbes to the world as his own capture, the headlines in Strathbane would scream about the brilliant Highland constable, and within a month, Hamish would find himself behind a desk in a grey city office, surrounded by traffic noise and filing cabinets. "Macbeth, open this door before I kick it off the hinges." DCI Blair's voice roared from the porch, accompanied by the frantic scratching of Jimmy Anderson trying to keep up. Hamish acted with the speed of a man fleeing a forest fire. He quickly unlocked the door but didn't open it. Instead, he grabbed Forbes by the shoulders and sat him firmly in the chair by the table, positioning the bicycle light so it cast a dramatic interrogation-style glow over the man's tear-stained face. He then shoved the iron poker into Forbes' limp hand, making it look as though the surveyor had just been disarmed. By the time the door flew open, Hamish was standing 3 feet back, looking dishevelled, panting heavily, and wearing an expression of profound, bovine confusion. Blair stormed in, his face a shade of magenta that suggested an imminent medical event. "What is the meaning of this, Macbeth?" "I am in the middle of processing a confession from that Crofter, and I hear you've been kidnapping the local gentry." "Oh, thank goodness you're here, sir," Hamish cried, his voice pitching into a panicked, high-pitched burr. He gestured wildly at the cowering Forbes. "It's been a nightmare, sir. I was just sitting here thinking about the brilliant points you made earlier about peasant rage when Mr. Forbes burst in. He was raving, sir, talking about digital dossiers and commissions from Edinburgh. He attacked me with the poker. I only remembered what you said about observing the psychological cracks, and I tried to apply your techniques, but I am afraid I've made a mess of it." Blair paused, his chest heaving. His eyes darted from the shattered teapot to the cuffed surveyor, then to the bicycle light. "My techniques? Aye, sir," Hamish said, wiping fake sweat from his brow. "The way you said the killer would be someone with a hidden agenda. It stayed with me. I was trying to lead him into a trap, just like you described in your lecture at the academy, but I almost let him get away. If you hadn't arrived right at this moment to provide the authoritative presence, I don't know what I would have done. He's confessed everything, sir. The murder of Mr. Waters, the land deals, it's all exactly as you suspected." Blair's ego, which was a vast and hungry thing, began to expand to fill the room. He looked at Forbes, who was far too broken to contradict the narrative, and then back at Hamish. The idea that his own genius had trickled down to the lowly constable was far more appealing than the idea that Hamish had solved the case alone. "Well," Blair huffed, straightening his tie and puffing out his chest, "I did say it was a matter of math, didn't I, Anderson? I knew the pressure of my investigation would flush out the real culprit. This is what happens when you apply high-level Strathbane pressure to a small-town mind. They crack, Macbeth. They always crack under my watch." "It was masterfully done, sir," Hamish added, looking at his boots. "I've written down everything he said, but I am sure I'll need your expert touch to make it a proper legal statement. Perhaps you should take him back to Strathbane now, before the press gets wind of your brilliant breakthrough." "The press?" "Yes, quite right," Blair barked, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of a front-page photo. "Anderson, get the cuffs off him. No, wait. Keep them on." I want the transport team to see his condition. Macbeth, clean yourself up. You look like a disgrace. And don't think this excuses your laziness. If I hadn't laid the groundwork, you'd still be staring at the fog. Hamish watched as Blair and Anderson dragged the weeping Forbes into the night. He waited until the taillights of the police cars had vanished into the mist before he finally let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the real phone Peter had given him. He walked to the kitchen range, opened the heavy iron door, and watched the small piece of plastic and glass vanish into the glowing heart of the peat fire. The evidence of Peter's involvement, the digital dossier of the village's secrets, and the only proof that Hamish had done anything more than survive an attack, all turned to smoke. He had saved Archie, he had caught a murderer, and most importantly, he had saved his own way of life. The following morning, the sun broke through the Highland mist with a rare golden brilliance, turning the waters of Lochstub into a shimmering sheet of polished silver. The aggressive sirens and shouting men of Strathbane had vanished like a bad dream, replaced by the rhythmic tolling of the church bell and the distant, comforting baaing of sheep on the hillside. For the rest of Scotland, the news was dominated by DCI Blair's extraordinary tactical sting that had unmasked a corrupt surveyor as a cold-blooded killer. In the local newspapers, Blair's purple face beamed next to a headline about metropolitan policing saving the rural north, a result that suited everyone involved perfectly. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite post-investigation ritual. The stove was humming with a steady heat, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the savoury aroma of a thick mutton stew simmering in a heavy iron pot. Lugg sprawled across the rug, twitching in his sleep, his paws occasionally paddling as he chased phantom rabbits in a world far removed from peat bogs and golf clubs. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of Archie McLean. The old Crofter looked tired, his face lined with the stress of his brief incarceration, but his eyes were clear. He carried a small burlap sack which he placed on Hamish's table with a heavy thud. "I hear the DCI is getting a medal, or something very like it, in Strathbane," Archie said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And I hear you were fortunate to be in the room when the surveyor decided to lose his mind." Hamish poured a mug of coffee and pushed it toward Archie.
Aye.
If the DCI hadn't been so thorough with his initial theories, I doubt I'd have had the presence of mind to even lock the door. We're lucky to have such sharp minds looking after us from the big city. Archie looked at Hamish for a long moment, a slow, knowing grin spreading across his weathered face. He reached into the sack and pulled out a large, gleaming Atlantic salmon, its scales still bright. "I found this wandering near the bank this morning. Thought it might be a nuisance to the river, so I brought it to you to dispose of. That's very civic-minded of you, Archie," Hamish replied gravely. "You'll see it's handled with the proper discretion." Once Archie had departed, Hamish set to work. He cleaned the fish with the practiced ease of a man who knew the value of silence and a sharp knife. As he worked, he thought of Peter, who had returned to the seawall with a lighter heart and a new sense of caution. The boy had learned that pride was a dangerous thing to carry, and Hamish had made sure the council contract remained firmly in the lad's hands by whispering a few choice words to the local councillor about Peter's bravery during the police action. The village had closed ranks again. The wellness retreat was a dead dream. The land deeds were being untangled by a far more honest firm from Inverness, and the memory of Geoffrey Waters was already fading into the salt-crusted history of the coast. To the world, Waters was a victim of a greedy local to Lochstub. He was merely a storm that had blown through and been forgotten. Late in the afternoon, Priscilla Halberton-Smythe pulled up in her sleek car. She didn't stay long, only long enough to drop off a small, hand-painted ceramic teapot to replace the one shattered in the fray. She stood in the doorway, looking at the peaceful Seneth sleeping dog, the bubbling stew, and the man who looked like he hadn't a care in the world beyond the quality of his next meal. And a very lucky one. Most people would want the world to know what they'd done, and most people end up living in a flat in Glasgow with no peat fire and no dog for company, Hamish replied, leaning back in his chair. "I have everything I need right here, Priscilla. A bit of peace, a full pot, and the knowledge that the only person who thinks him a genius is Lug Sandhe's easily impressed by a bit of suet." She laughed, a sound like clear water over stones, and left him to his solitude. As the twilight deepened into a rich, velvet purple, Hamish sat by the window, watching the lights of the village twinkle one by one. He was still just a village bobby, a man the hierarchy considered a failure, and that was his greatest victory. He took a long, satisfying sip of his coffee, petted Lug's velvet ears, and settled in for a long, quiet Highland night. The peace of Lochstub had been restored, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the only reward that ever truly mattered.